Well, I'd like to move to a little bit more modern conversation now and talk about the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's evident when we look at the civil rights movement that injustice in our nation did not end in 1865. The civil rights movement generated competing factions that disagreed over how to right the wrongs of our nation's ongoing racial injustice. So, how should we discuss the Black Panther movement or Malcolm X or the maybe radically different ideas of MLK?
It's another great question. The fact is that the civil rights movement was very important. It's a movement that we have, I think now at this point, put in most of our history books, right? But most of our history books, American history books, probably won't mention the Black Panthers, or if they do, they'll mention them in a way that is negative. Same with Malcolm X. Anything that's a little bit more radical doesn't sit well with many of our history books, and I think that's a problem. I think that we need to include as equally as possible. I know the civil rights movement was a big one because it included various groups and iconic people that we know about, Martin Luther King, and so on. But there was great work done by so many other groups along the way before the civil rights movement and leading out of it. So there was for example, a great literary movement called the Harlem Renaissance in the earlier in the 20th century that really made such wonderful moves, thinking as a humanist who studies art. That's a great way of thinking of what that work did to bring us to the 1950s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. And of course, music plays all the way through this. But let me not go there. Or maybe I can, right? So we think of the civil rights movement and we think of We Shall Overcome, these wonderful civil rights songs that really had an impact on folk music. So we hear it from Pete Seeger, we hear it from Bob Dylan, but this was music that civil rights activists were singing as they were marching, as they were sitting in, and so on. That's great. But we also have songs by people like Nina Simone, Curtis Mayfield, James Brown, that were a little bit more urgent, that said, we need to get up and get moving. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, get up everybody, it's time to get going. All of these all together are important. Even as we focus on the civil rights movement, we tend to focus only on Martin Luther King, but what about Diane Nash, who really helped organize a lot of that work that was done in the South? What about Rosa Parks? I know we mention her, but do we know what her own personal history was? What about people like Fannie Lou Hamer? I'm mentioning, of course, all the Black women because we typically have left them out. What about John Lewis? These are other people that we should be mentioning. We are too selective in the ways in which we retell our histories. I have great respect for the civil rights movement, but also for the Black Power movement, for the Black Panthers. What they did for their communities is completely radical and wonderful. So anyway, that's my spiel for bringing a wider lens to the histories that we tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that thoroughness and completeness is really important when teaching any of these movements, the civil rights movement, certainly also the abolitionist movement, or when teaching the American founding era. You have to not only teach, as I mentioned earlier, the Mount Rushmore version of the history, you have to teach it completely and thoroughly. I think actually the civil rights movement is probably one of the most egregious examples of the Mount Rushmore approach, not giving a complete and full picture and not educating students as thoroughly as they should be. So the Martin Luther King Jr. Monument in Washington, D.C. is actually amazing and incredible. I recommend it to anybody. But he was not the only important figure in the civil rights movement, and it's important not to lose the contributions of other people and other parts of the civil rights movement, which haven't gone away, right? So even though Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership of the civil rights movement is what we now teach about primarily in schools and talk about, the other aspects of the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, and that's still their ideas and their approach and their activism, that's still relevant today, and neglecting it is only to our detriment, I think. I'll add to Stephanie's list of overlooked figures, and there are many. Ida B. Wells, I think, as a forerunner of the civil rights movement, extremely important. I can't overstate how important she was to the civil rights movement ultimately, and the light that she threw on the practice of lynching through her journalism. Frederick Douglass praises her in a preface to her pamphlet and says that she did more for the cause of racial equality and justice than he himself thinks he ever did. So, but she's forgotten to most textbooks, and most students don't know who she is. It's nice when I have undergraduates to be able to surprise them with something that they've never heard before and see their eyes light up, and that's great. But I'd rather if that didn't happen when I mention Ida Wells or Malcolm X, right, and his contribution to the civil rights movement. I'd rather if they had some sort of grounding in the full picture of these movements.
And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention other movements that have carried on, like the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements that have fought for the disenfranchised, the marginalized, and those that are still on the margins of power and economic and social mobility.